morning. Welcome to this Mid-Suffolk Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting. I'm Councillor Keith Wellham and I'm chairing the meeting today. May I first remind you of some domestic arrangements. Please ensure that microphones are turned off when not in use. Please don't interrupt other speakers. If you are attending the meeting to speak and persistently interrupt the meeting, you may be asked to leave. Please ensure your mobile phones are on silent or switched off. Similarly, laptops and tablets, please. Additionally, we will be using e-voting for this meeting on the modern.gov app. I'd like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live to the internet and will be capable of repeated viewing. The whole of the meeting will be filmed, except where there are confidential or exempt items. If you make a representation to the meeting, you will be deemed by the Council to have consented to being filmed. By entering the meeting as a speaker, you are also consenting to being recorded by the Council and to the possible use of those images and sound recordings for webcasting and or training purposes. The Council, members of the public and the press may record, film, photograph or broadcast this meeting when the public and the press are not lawfully excluded. Thank you. Can I ask Alicia, the lead officer for Overview and Scrutiny, to tell us all who's attending today? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So members, we have Emily Atack, who is the Director for Assets and Investments. We have Rebecca Hewitt, who is the Corporate Manager for Finance, Commissioning and Procurement. And also councillors in attendance, we have Councillor Whitehead, who is the Cabinet Member for Finance. And we also have Councillor Field and Councillor Eburn as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can I move to the agenda, please? Are there any apologies for absence and any substitutions?
None received, Chair.
Thank you. We are all here, which is good. Are there any declarations of pecuniary or other registrable or non-registrable interest by members? No, there are none. Thank you. Are there any petitions in accordance with the Council's petition scheme, please?
None received, Chair.
Thank you. Any questions from the public?
None received.
Any questions by councillors?
None received, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can we then move straight on to item 6, which is the Draft General Fund and Housing Revenue Account for 23-24 and the 4-year outlook. And I'd like to invite John Whitehead, the Cabinet Member for Finance, to introduce the report to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I was at the ONS meeting on the 13th of January this year. That was where the committee recommended that they wanted to be involved earlier in the development of the budget, so enabling a more strategic approach to scrutinising the budget. So here we are at ONS in November 22, so we're 2 months now earlier into the budget process for 23-24 than we were last year with ONS, and I think this new approach I'm sure will evolve over time, but we would appreciate ONS's considered views on the assumptions behind the 23-24 budget for both the General Fund and the HRA. So now we're looking at the period from the 1st of April 23 to the 31st of March 24, and based on current economic data. But I don't need to tell ONS that this has been quite an exceptional year when it comes to the economic viewpoint. I mean, this time last year, for example, our Treasury advisors were forecasting base rates through to 2024 to remain at 0.5%, and now they're more likely to be 4.5 to 5%, so a 9 to 10-fold error in forecasting due to global events that have happened between November last year and this year. Since 2008, which is 14 years ago, we've had very low base rates and Bank of England quantitative easing. And for someone, say, in their mid-30s, so in other words, well into their career, this has been the norm. And so recent increases just have come like a bolt out of the blue. But I think for some of us more seasoned folks, I mean, I was studying economics in the mid-1970s, it's been these last few years that's been the anomaly. And more recent things like inflation, higher base rates, things like strikes, etc., overpay, just seem more normal to the likes of myself. Obviously, we're having a separate ONS meeting for Mid-Suffolk here, looking at the budget, because the Babergh and Mid-Suffolk budgets are quite separate, distinct outlooks. For Babergh has a funding gap of 2 million for 2023, and a gap of that size would need a 35% increase in council tax to close it. Obviously, they won't be doing that. Instead of looking for savings and efficiencies and maximising income, and I guess they'll have some quite difficult political decisions. Obviously, here we're looking at a budget surplus of 2 million, so it's quite a different scenario. But given that the separate councils do have the same workforce, I think there are some interesting challenges ahead. So without more ado, Rebecca's got a presentation, a few slides to take us through, where we'll look at the various assumptions, and I think we're going to take questions, if that's okay, on a sort of slide-by-slide basis rather than leave them to the end. Okay? Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to take you through a few slides that kind of outline what we've already set out in the report, and give us a chance to ask questions and delve into it a little bit. So starting with the 23-24 budget as we forecast it back in February 22. Obviously there's been quite a bit of change since then, but at that time we were looking at a net cost of service of £9 million and funding of 13.2 million, giving a 4.1 million surplus. Back at that time, we had some assumptions around pay award, so we were assuming that the pay award for 22-23 would be 2% plus the annual increments. We assumed that inflation on contracts would be around 2%, and we assumed that funding for 23-24 would be flat. Obviously, events have changed since then, and we are seeing a lot of that in 22-23 also. So within 22-23, we are seeing inflationary pressures of around 870,000 as per our latest reports. These pressures are not expected to go away, so there's obviously an ongoing impact of some of these pressures that we're seeing into 23-24. First of all, the pay award, the national agreed pay award was £1,925 per person. That's a pressure of 640,000 over the 2% that we had assumed within the budget for 22-23. We've also seen fuel and energy increases, giving a pressure of around 90,000, and then other inflationary increases, in particular around maintenance work, of around 140,000. For 22-23, we've got the inflationary pressure reserve, which we set aside at the end of 21-22. 500,000 will cover the most of that pressure. But as I said, these pressures are expected to continue into 23-24, and we can only use that reserve once. So the impact on 23-24 is ongoing for these. We're not expecting negative inflation to take all of that pressure away. And then we are currently budgeting a surplus of around 3 million for 22-23, or forecasting 3 million against a budget of around 4 million.
Councillor Epion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You say you can only use the inflationary reserve once. So that's just a pot of 500,000 that was put aside for this year. So we don't have a similar reserve for next year and the years after.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So what I'm going to do today is we're going to look at all of the assumptions that we've currently got in the 23-24 budget that we're currently building. So these are the key assumptions that we want to put forward to you today, so that you can have a look at those, challenge those, ask questions, give us feedback on those assumptions. What we're looking at here is what the cost of service was in 22-23 and what are the pressures that are building, or the changes in income, and what impact that's having on 23-24. For the pay award, 22-23, as I said, 1925 per FTE. This is
Councillor Ekpiyong is desperate to ask you a question, Rebecca.
I'm sorry to interrupt your flow, but I think it's important for us to understand what this document really represents, because to me, I don't understand how you've arrived at the impacts, because the first column only talks about the budget, not what's actually happened so far this year, what you expect to happen this year. So I'm really would like to understand the rationale for these, how you've arrived at the impacts and the underlying reasoning and what it really means, because I think then that just flows through to the rest of the document, really.
Yeah, before you answer, Councillor Eburn.
Thank you, Chair, because just to follow up, if I may, when you're answering that, the figures that you've given here and in the paper are different to the ones that you showed in the presentation. So I was trying to work out where that figure that you presented in the previous PowerPoint slide, where that fitted in with this 9,157 figure. Thank you.
okay. So for these slides and these figures, what we've done is we're doing the comparison to the 22-23 budget, but that's not necessarily how we've built the final figures. So we've looked at all of the pressures that we've seen in 22-23, and then looked at which of those we're expecting to continue into 23-24. So the budget, 22-23 budget shows the budget as we projected in February 22. We're then for each section building up those pressures that we're seeing in 22-23 that we're expecting to continue, and then any other changes in 23-24 on top of that. Does that help?
Sort of. So presumably you have calculated based on what's actually happened so far this year and what you expect to happen in the rest of the year. You have a calculation for that, and that is the base. It can't be the budget. I mean, you can't compare two budgets. I mean, that's not, I don't see the value of that. So I'm assuming what you really mean is that you're looking at what's actually happened so far this year, plus what you expect to happen in the rest of the year, and then you're assessing the impact of that, and then looking forward with that. And this paper doesn't say that.
Yes, I'll say that. But yes, that is how we have approached it. So we have looked at what has built up this year and how that will continue into next year.
Did you clarify Councillor Eburn's point, and I think her question, and also Councillor Field, you have a question?
We have time for clarification first.
Right, okay.
Yes, Councillor Eburn, it was about the numbers, wasn't it? So,
Yes, it was where the number that you put up a number about the pressures on pay, but I wanted to know where that number was in that number didn't relate to any of these figures that we've got on those first three rows of that table.
okay, yes. So that pressure there is the 22-23 per person, 640,000. I'll have to take away how that compares to the 258 in that table.
Okay, one for me. Just to be absolutely clear to myself, you're assuming at the moment business as it is at the moment. You're not building in, obviously, any political decisions to do more things or to do less things. Are there any factors that are already in forward plans that are adjusting these figures? You know, we've decided to do something substantial that's occurred. So that's one question. What's the basis of the, I can see the numbers, but what's the amount of effort we're requiring, if you like? What business are we running? And the other point is just a simple one. You've got a pay award for 22-23, which you say is equivalent to 8%, and it gives an increase of 258k. And then you take about the 23-24 is a 4% increase, and that gives me a 513k increase. I just wondered, is that the time at which it's effective, or what? Why is 4% twice as big as 8?
Yes, thank you for your question. So, in terms of the numbers, you're right, it is the business that we're currently doing, so we're not projecting changes in the service at this point. There is work ongoing with SLT, and then it will be brought back to cabinets about further changes, so savings and additional pressures will be brought, and that will be a separate piece of work that will follow on from here. But this is the extension of what we're currently doing and what the impact is on those. In terms of that pay award 22-23, looking at that number now, I can see that 258. I'll need to look into where that came from.
Is that the pressure on top of what's already in the budget, so you can compare it with the one below?
Yeah, maybe.
Apologies, just to step in. I think the reason you've got 258 is in the box against the 8% is that's the pressure on top of what's already in the budget. So the budget assumed a percentage increase, and that's the amount on top of what was assumed. So I think it's an extra 2%. So you can't compare it like for like with the 4% below.
Yeah, it might be useful to have that clarified perhaps after the meeting, because it does appear to be odd, because I'm not sure whether the impact 23-24 includes the impact that we've already seen in 22-23, but I think that's what we need to have clarified. Councillor Ekpingham.
Yes, I think I understand what the Director for Assets and Investment is saying, but it seems that effectively an extra 6% is costing an extra 258,000, but an extra 4%, which is on top of what's already happened, would be 513,000. So, you know, there is a bit of a difference there, but I'm not sure whether it's really quite as large as it's suggested here. Is that right? If you've already increased something once and then you increase it again, you're starting from a higher base. So that would suggest that the figure for the 4% will be larger, but is it actually that large compared to the previous? I don't know.
You're probably right, but to avoid this question being asked again when we get further into the process, it would be useful to have that clarified, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so looking through the assumptions on the pay, so as we said, we've got the pay award for 22-23. That impact will continue into 23-24. For 23-24, we have discussed with the other Suffolk authorities what they are proposing to assume for the nationally agreed pay award. At this point, we don't know what that will be and what pressure inflation will put on that discussion. But in line with the other Suffolk authorities, we are currently projecting a 4% increase for that. In addition to that, we have the agreed pay review for the council-wide review of pay. Work is ongoing on this, so we do not know at this stage what that impact will be. but we have included 550,000 within the current working budget for that at this point until we have further detail as that work progresses. For the pension...
Councillor Pignon.
Thank you, Chairman. So, if I've understood this correctly, we had the 9,157,000. Is that the total budget for pay?
Yes, that's the total budget for 22-23 for pay.
Okay, so we're expecting it to go up by about 12% next year. That's what the figures are saying. So, I guess my question is, why would you have there's something fundamentally I don't understand about the assumption of the 4% and indeed the amount that's been set aside for the pay review. I mean, essentially what I'm looking at here is £1.4 million of increase on a £9.2 million budget.
Thank you, Councillor. So there are different elements of the pay review. So the pay award, which is being assumed at 4% next year, that's set nationally. So what we've done in terms of the assumptions is talk to our colleagues in Suffolk and I suppose test our assumption against their assumptions, and that 4% is the assumed rate of increase for the National Pay Award, effectively. In addition to that, Mid-Suffolk has undertaken to have a review of pay across the councils along with Babergh District Council. So that is looking at whether the salary bandings are correct, whether the pay is appropriate for each job. So it's a slightly different focus, it's more individual. That review is ongoing, and we won't know the impact of that until that review is further progressed. So we are making an assumption or a provision of £550,000 for the outcome of that review. We can't really do any more than that until the work is further progressed. So that's a reasonable contingency figure for that pay review process.
Thank you. Yeah, a couple of questions then. Obviously, you've sort of talked to other authorities in Suffolk to get the 4%. What is the feeling nationally? Because I think 4% is actually quite conservative in terms of a pay increase potential, with inflation not likely to drop very heavily until probably the following year. So I wondered whether you've taken any advice nationally on that. And a question on the pay review section. You assume the cost impact of 500,000 and tell us that it's going to be funded from the contingency budget. Is that a reserve or is that a budget? I mean, because you've talked about the 500,000 that you're going to be spending from the reserve in order to support. So a little bit of clarity really on what is the contingency budget. Is it a separate reserve or whatever? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your question. Yes, so when it comes to the pay award and our discussions with Suffolk, we appreciate that there will be pressure because of inflation not expected to come down, and pressure to increase for that to be higher. We also appreciate that central government will be trying to keep spending down, and equally there'll be pressure the other way. In all honesty, there's not much of a steer on which way it may go next year at this point in time. There wasn't anything clear in the autumn statement last week, and we haven't had any indication of where that would go. There is a risk that could be higher than 4%. There's also a chance it could be lower, but that is what we're going for at this stage. And obviously, that's an assumption that we can review and challenge if that's not felt to be the best one to make.
Councillor Whitehead.
Yeah, perhaps if I could just interject. Looking back at the recommendation, its recommendation is to look at the budget assumptions that are behind this, and really it's the assumption column, I think, that's the key thing here, rather than necessarily the numbers. So in other words, to Councillor Scarf's point about, is the 4% assumption for a pay award next year, is that right? Is that a good assumption, or should it be 3%, 5%, or 6%? I think to some extent the numbers in the right-hand column are fairly irrelevant. If we can feel we're comfortable with the assumptions, then the assumptions feed into the sausage machine that produces, the ultimate numbers. But I think the key thing today is really to sort of concentrate on the assumptions behind the budget as it's being put forward at the moment, and whether those are, good figures. So, for example, the first one, which says the pay award for 22-23, which is £925 per person, the reality is that although it's in the assumption column, that's now a done deed. That has been, agreed nationally. So although there's an impact next year, it's irrelevant in some ways to even look at that, because that is a fact. But whereas the next one down, the 4%, is an assumption. So the question is, with these future predictions or assumptions, the question is, do we feel they're accurate or not? And then we would like to get the wisdom of ONS on that, and then carry that forward, and I say then feed these percentages, etc., into the sausage machine. Obviously, the third one, which is a pay review, is no point talking about assumptions there. We basically need a figure, which in this case is 550,000, because that's a feeling as to the total sum of money that would be needed as part of the pay review, to alter salaries. I hope that clarifies.
Well, it's sort of, I think it does clarify, but I think if we're looking at assumptions, we need to see what the impact is as well. So I think we can't ignore the two right-hand columns. We've got to look at it across the board. And I think it's similar to Councillor Scarf's question about whether it's a contingency budget or a reserve. So it says there, at this stage, it's proposed to assume a cost impact of 500k to be funded from the contingency budget. Now, if that's a reserve, is it in the budget? If it's, and how does the 500 relate to the 550 in the other column?
Yes, thank you. I believe the 500 is potentially a typing error, and that should be 550,000. The amount will be included within the budget. There isn't a reserve to cover that. When it talks about the contingency budget, I believe that is the vacancy management contingency that we currently have within our budget, which is equivalent to a similar amount.
Thank you. Any more questions before we move on? Councillor Field.
Just another minor one, perhaps. You mentioned increments. I wonder, are they included in the 550 pay review process? And a view on percentages and things. There is clearly £1 million uplift in the salary budget here, which is somewhere over 10% for 23-24, and my view would be that is comparable inflation and is a reasonable sort of number to stick to. So, that you've created that as a 4% hike plus a salary review, but the thing in totality does seem to get a reasonable match to inflation. So it sounds a valid way forward. But I would be grateful if I knew where the standard increments, which are an increase in salary, where they sit in this set of figures.
Yes, thank you for the question. That increment for 23-24 will be in that 4%. So I think the 4% covers inflationary and increments.
Are you happy to press on then, Rebecca? Thank you. Oh, sorry, Councillor Ekpignon.
taking on board Councillor Whitehead's recommendation, could you explain the assumption under pensions, please?
Yes, certainly. So we have recently had a valuation of the council's pension fund, so the pot for Mid-Suffolk, and that has been favourable. So we have been able to reduce our contribution to the deficit that we have been making in previous years. And this year there's been a slight change to the method for doing that. So in 22-23, we had a lower employer contribution of 23% and then a lump sum payment towards the deficit that the council was making. And this year, following discussion with Suffolk County Council, we're proposing to make a 26% employer's contribution and based on employee salaries, and then not paying the lump sum payment to the deficit that we were doing previously. So that overall cost the council less by 353,000 estimate.
Okay to carry on.
I think I could do with a 26% contribution to my pension, I'll tell you.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Rebecca.
Okay, so that's the pension fund as well. And then at the bottom there, we've got a vacancy management factor. So every year in the budget, we have an amount that we assume will be there. That is due to retirements, resignations, new posts and natural turnover. But the council will never have 100% of staff in post all the time. And therefore, we have previously had a 5% effective saving in the budget or an underspend for those vacant posts. As the salary is increasing, then that 5% increases as well. So you'll see a 97,000 increase in that.
Thank you. Councillor Scarf.
Thank you. I mean, this is a question that we've asked, I think, many times before on the vacancy management factor, because in reality the figures jump around 9, 12, even higher percent. So the question would be, as same as usual, is this a realistic vacancy management factor at 5%? Because I suspect the figure is actually usually higher than that, and we've had it come to scrutiny and then come to council, and the figures have altered even in between those two different meetings. So is it realistic at 5%?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. We do monitor the vacancy management factor quite carefully. It is a difficult one to predict because it does depend on what individual staff members do decide to do. It also depends on the market for recruitment at any point in time and how difficult it might be to recruit to any particular role. I think our view collectively is that 5% is a reasonable assumption, but we do, take on board that point that it is just an assumption. There will be fluctuations over time depending on the market, I suppose, in many respects. And we're cautious about, I suppose, how we balance that, because if we assume it is a greater figure, that will show a greater saving, but equally if we assume too lower figure, then there won't be that positive saving there, which then may mean that we don't have funds, or we over budget, I suppose, for that saving, which means we don't have those funds. So it's about finding a kind of prudent rate. That 5% seems to be, on balance, the right kind of assumption, but we do continue to monitor.
Thank you. I've got. Is this a follow-up to that question? Right. Certainly. Carry on.
If I can just follow up on that. I mean, obviously, in Mid-Suffolk, we've not got the same situation as our partner council, but issues like this, if the figures are an assumption, which I still think is actually wrong, it would make a vast difference, because you would be, in the case of the other council, you would be making cutbacks, and you're making them based on assumptions that never seem to be right. The 5%, I think, has never been the right figure as the balance overall, ever since I've been a member of the council again, in 3 years, and we question this every year, and I just think we need to be a little bit more acute with that assumption figure. I mean, it's very difficult for us sitting here as members to work through these figures. We've only got through the first page so far, probably the most significant page, but I don't know about other members, but I'm sitting here actually quite confused about what the figures are, what the assumptions are based on, and lots of things. And I think when we've got these completely variable factors and the information in front of us is not perhaps as clear as it might be, it's very difficult for us as members to actually make a constructive comment to put forward into the ongoing considerations for the budget. I just think that's a point that, needs to be recognised.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Scarf. Councillor Ebert.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to simply ask what has been the vacancy management the vacancy rate in the first 6 months of this year, please? Because I know it's in some areas it went up to 17% last year in particular departments, but what has it been this year? Thank you.
We'll have to come back to you with that figure, but I am conscious that our headcount has increased quite significantly over the last 12 months as well, and so we need to factor that into the vacancy factor debate as well, because we've actually recruited to a number of the roles that have been vacant over the last 12 months. But we'll provide that figure outside of this meeting, if that's okay.
Or if I may, what the rolling figure is then, because it was, we'll know what the vacancy management rate was for last financial year, and presumably there should be somewhere someone's recording a rolling figure on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Ekpignon, then I'm coming to Councillor Whitehead.
Thank you, Chairman. I heard my question is very similar to Councillor Eban's, but actually I think what we ought to be looking at is what has been the annual vacancy rate over the term of this, or this term, and indeed I'm sure we have figures going further back, but at least for this term that we're sitting, we ought to have the figures, and that ought to inform the assumption that we're making, and which I think is what the director was hinting at. But it'd be good to understand what those figures were actually in those previous financial years.
Yes, and if I could add to that, if there is a pay review, and if that pay review does actually increase salaries, then perhaps that makes us more attractive, so the vacancy rate may reduce. But I think we need to make sure that all of those things have been taken into account. Councillor Whitehead.
Yes, I mean, looking at this vacancy management factor, I think in the last year we've asked for figures and we've had snapshots. I mean, basically it's a snapshot in time whenever we've been given a figure. So it might have been 12% in April and 9% in August. I'm just plucking these figures out of the air, but they're probably fairly realistic. I think probably what we need to do is almost have that reported, or the data available month by month, and sort of graph it to track it, because I think it's on a downward trajectory. So basically when it comes to April next year, the question is, where will it be? What's a realistic figure? We're saying that 5%, I think, is, as Councillor Scarf said, is probably a conservative figure. But the reality is, say if the pay review goes through, and as the Chairman said, it makes recruitment easier. I think we're heading into a recession nationally, and you'd probably expect public sector recruitment to become easier in a recession because it's seen as more stable employment. But this gets to the heart of the crux of the, how difficult it is to make budget assumptions, because it's how long is a piece of string. But 5% we feel is a prudent figure. Obviously, we could go to zero, and that would probably put another £500,000 of cost on there, which we know is unrealistic because we always have a vacancy. But it's going to be somewhere, I think, between 5 and 8%. It's just a question of really where we pitch it.
Yeah, just one other point on the vacancy rate. When we've been quoted vacancy statistics over the year, quite often they have been in headcount, but presumably this is 5% salary, not 5% headcount. Yeah, thank you. Councillor Carter. Sorry, Councillor Caston.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I think I can understand why you wouldn't have you'd almost need a live document to have that vacancy rate, adjusting the whole time. The Babergh employee cost is about 700,000 less, but you still have the same vacancy rate in there. Where do we have we got a lot of vacancies with joint officers for both councils? How does that work really, with there being a lot less of a employee cost in Babergh but still having the same vacancy rate? Are we talking about people that just work for Babergh?
Shall I take that one? So in the majority of cases, we don't have employees who work exclusively for one council or the other. We're all employed to undertake activities for both councils. However, depending on the nature of our work, that split between Babergh and Mid Suffolk might differ. So it might be that you have a caseload that has more Mid Suffolk work, and so potentially 70% of your work might be Mid Suffolk, and therefore 70% of your salaries may be attributed to Mid Suffolk. So there are very few posts that are exclusive to one council or the other. I suppose in terms of the difference between Babergh and Mid Suffolk and still applying that 5% vacancy factor, it is a percentage, so it is looking at that overall cost. So if it's 5% of a lower number, then it's a lower saving overall compared to 5% of a higher number, I suppose. So there is the same logic applied in terms of whether whether the percentage number is correct, regardless of how high the salary costs are.
Yeah. Okay. How do we manage that if, say, an officer's doing because obviously you're not billing for time in what you're doing. How do we proportion that in these budgets? Do we just, because I understand you can't get it exactly right. It would be almost impossible unless they were actually recording, timesheeting all their hours. But how do we do that? So why is Babergh less then, if that's how it's working?
There's an inter-service agreement between the two councils that basically allocate salary costs. As a default, it's 50-50, but I think there's some areas like planning where there tends to be more planning activity in Mid Suffolk. So I think planning is shared 55-45%. And for example, on quite a lot of the new projects that have come out of those £1 million pots of money, those people are exclusively being employed to work on projects for Mid Suffolk, and in those cases they're 100%. So where we've got 97,000 as impact on Mid Suffolk, the equivalent figure in Babergh is 83,000. So 97 to 83 is not a big difference, but it just shows that on balance there's more salary costs in Mid Suffolk than there are in Babergh, just because there are one or two areas where Mid Suffolk
we're doing more
than the half.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Look, can I follow that up with a question? You referred to the £1 million pots of money. If Mid Suffolk are to make more progress with spending those £1 million pots of money, it's pretty clear, extra staff could well be required in order to do that. And where would they show up in a budget? Would they be charged to the project? Would they be within employee costs? And have we therefore assumed that there will be no extra staff to work on those pots of money?
Insofar as those pots of money are reserves and they are for these projects, those employees that commence, say, for the first 24 months, their costs would go against money already put aside. It's only if the projects were to continue beyond that initial period that they start to impact the base budget.
So in simple terms, the cost of employing these people on short-term contracts comes out of the jam jar, it doesn't come out of the budget.
Yeah, correct.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? I think we finished that page. If there are no more questions, we finished that page. So, Rebecca, do you want to turn over to the next page?
Certainly. So on the next page, we've got some assumptions around some of our other costs. So electricity being one of them, we have seen, in line with the national picture, a big increase in electricity costs. So we're currently forecasting 24p a kilowatt hour compared to 14p per kilowatt hour previously. That does have a £255,000 impact. For gas, our current contract is fixed until the end of September 23. There is a price cap on there as well, which is being a benefit to the council. A lot of the usage applies to the leisure centres, and any increase in that should be recovered through the contract with the provider. We do not yet know what the price of gas will be when that contract ends. We are seeing in the market some reductions potentially in future, and we get our gas through a contractor which has the ability to negotiate on that price as well. So currently we have not put any additional pressure into the 23-24 budget for that. For fuel costs, the outturn is in line with budget for 22-23. It's a relatively small part of the overall budget for the council as well. Therefore, based on our experience of 22-23, we are not showing any additional pressure into 23-24 at this point. For recycling and waste, there's a £60,000 budget for fuel, and the actual fuel costs are lower than that budget. So even if there is a 5% increase in 23-24, that will be no increase overall because of what we're seeing in 22-23. Where we are potentially seeing some big inflationary increases on the insurance premium. The contract is renewed annually in January, and in the market we're seeing some significant increases in those insurance contracts. Therefore, we have forecast a 10% increase in cost in January 23 compared to our renewal price in January 22. And that is a potential £50,000 impact in 23-24 for that. Shared legal service is another area where we're potentially seeing some increase. So we put an uplift on that for salaries and other costs. And currently we're projecting 11% increase on that, or 27,000. In the refuse contract, we've got a cost pressure potentially for staff costs, and then within the shared revenues partnership, we're forecasting a 5% increase, and that estimate is based on inflationary increases. Again, that is mostly staff. Although they are absorbing some of the impact of staff cost increases, we are expecting to see an increase there as well.
Could we pause there? Councillor Eburn has a question. I think Councillor Ekping after that, and then Councillor Scarf. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I was waiting for someone in the committee was going to ask, but I just wondered why the shared legal service, the 11%, is rather much larger than the rest of the organisation, and I just wanted just a bit more detail on the assumption of that, please.
Okay, thank you. I don't have that detail to hand, so I will take that one away and see what they are. I know there are other costs other than salaries in there, but I'll find out what those are.
Thank you. Councillor Ekping.
Thank you, Chair. I'm concerned about these assumptions on this page, given that a large chunk of it is related to staff costs. So we've seen on the previous page that effectively we're saying that salaries in 23-24 are going to go up at least by inflation of more than 10%. But all these other staff-related costs are going to increase by much less, which for me isn't entirely logical. And I'm also concerned that actually with regard to the pay award in 23-24, if we have actually given staff an inflation rate pay increase this year, why would we not give them an inflation rate increase next year? I think we'd have a lot of problem explaining that away. So I think these particular salary-related assumptions need a serious review, I would say, and a much better explanation of the base from which they're being set.
And I've got Councillor Scarf.
Yeah, well, it was along similar lines to Councillor Eburn, because obviously the shared legal costs are going up by 11%, and that tells us that's other likely costs and an uplift for salaries. The shared revenues partnership is going up by 5%, and that's based on inflationary increases, which we now know, because the officer has just told us, is pay related. So there is this disparity that is really difficult to fathom out. So I think what the previous two councillors have spoken about is really essentially right.
Councillor Caston.
I wasn't surprised to see that, because there's a real recruitment crisis going on in law, and there's a supply and demand issue where if you don't put your wages up, your people will move to somewhere that will. And there's been the wage increase in law has been higher than anything else on here, I think, and so I think that's a completely acceptable percentage there. It's different. I know we've got a recruitment crisis in lots of different aspects of the council, but the legal profession is particularly high at the moment.
Thank you. Can I ask about any income or saving as a result of the solar panels at the leisure centre? You were saying that if there is an increase in the price of gas, it doesn't matter to our budget because it would have to be met from the leisure centre, but there could be a great decrease in the amount of energy used at the leisure centres because of the solar panels. Where does that figure in here?
Yes, thank you for the question. I don't have the details on that, I'm afraid, of what has been included, but I know they will be incorporating that into the final budget. So that is being looked into and will be incorporated into that. But I don't at this point know how much that is or how that is being.
So are you saying that might be somewhere other than in supplies and services?
So thank you for the question. So I think what Rebecca is trying to say is that we don't have that figure in terms of the impact that the new solar panels will have on reducing the electricity costs at the leisure centres as yet, but that will be included as part of the final budget when it's presented in January. I think it comes back here, so we will provide that additional data at that point. But it's a fair comment to raise. So thank you.
Thank you. Anything else, or do we now move on a bit? Thank you, Rebecca.
So the next bit that we've got on the slides is the sales fees and charges. There is a big piece of work ongoing about the fees and charges and what is reasonable for 23-24. So just to say that this does not include any price increases. We are just looking at the current position and the forecast based on what we have at this present time. So for planning income, we know that we are seeing reduction in demand due to the national picture and uncertainty within the housing market. So based on the 22-23 forecast outturn, we are seeing a pressure of around 130,000 there. So we'll be building that into the budget for 23-24. For garden and trade waste income, we are seeing a slight increase in trade waste and then garden waste subscriptions as well. But we are assuming minimal growth for garden waste as per the 22-23 forecast outturn. So we're basing those very much on what we're seeing in the current picture for 22-23 and projecting that forward into 23-24. So there'll be a 58,000 benefit to that 23-24 budget based on our current estimates. Building control, we are seeing a lot of uncertainty in the market and some significant change in regulations, but we feel that the 22-23 budget is still a reasonable assumption for 23-24 as well.
Any more questions up to that point? Councillor Carter.
I know there's proposed changes due to the bin collections, which were due to start in 23, if I remember from the last report. Are these taken account of? So do you believe we're supposed to be changing the number of bins, changing the way the subscription service has been done? Is that going to make an impact in how the budget is presented? How are we going to, if we are going to be making more bins and changing the bins, and so is there going to be a cost involved, and is this cost reflected, or is this going to be done at a later date and not part of this budget?
Thank you for that question. So we're still waiting for further guidance from government in relation to the changes to bin collections. There is uncertainty in terms of what additional services will be required of us, and equally whether there will be any further support from government to assist those additional services. So for the purpose of this budget, we haven't made any assumptions in that regard. Obviously, if there is further information between now and January, February time when the budget is set, we will look to incorporate that within the budget, but that hasn't been part of our assumptions at this point in time.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I've got one more question, and that is, I'm looking at the shared legal service, I'm looking at the shared revenues partnership. If both of those services are mainly staff, why is one going up by 11% and the other by 5%?
I can't really speak on behalf of the shared legal services, but although I take Councillor Caston's point that lawyers' salaries perhaps are being increased perhaps more than the average, but I do sit on the shared revenues partnership committee, and that's consistently brought in its numbers below budget in terms of costs. So I think at the end of last year we got something like £60,000 or £70,000, effectively like a dividend or a rebate. So we were below budget, so by say 50 or 60,000 our share of it. So we're sort of starting below. So a 5% increase over budget is still a bigger jump than at 5% than it appears in the numbers, because we're sort of starting with a bit of a bonus coming in.
Yeah, I understand that now. Thank you. Can we just move on now? We've got to. We're on to interest. Yeah. Any questions on interest? Councillor Eburn.
Thank you, Chair. I just, with regards to the short-term borrowing, I just wanted to know what those assumptions are based on. So, for example, if we were, are there any plans to receive any capital receipts that might reduce our overall short-term borrowing? And if so, is that taken into account? Or are there any plans to change it throughout the year, next financial year, 23-24? And so just a more detail, please, on that assumption. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, certainly. Thank you for the question. So in terms of the short-term borrowing, currently we're not including any new borrowing in the short term for 23-24. It will be as we look at the capital programme and that goes through Cabinet and Council, then that decision will be reviewed, and we will have to look at the impact of the proposed capital programme and build that in as part of the next stage on kind of savings and pressures from that. There is the potential that we are aware that there may be capital receipts that we can apply instead of instead of taking out new borrowing, and we are reviewing what that will look like and how much that could be. So at this stage we have not finalised what that amount will be, but we are expecting to potentially not have to borrow as much as we would do otherwise.
Chair, can I come back
Yes,
if
please
I may?
do.
So currently the assumption is based on just business as usual with regards to short-term borrowing. When is it planned to be reviewed? So in terms of that figure changing. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think for this paper, we've got the assumptions around borrowing rates. Again, as we mentioned, it's a slightly earlier time to be bringing budget to ONS. So part of the work that's going on around developing the budget is also looking at what our capital programme is for the forthcoming years, including what capital receipts we're expecting. So that work's actually happening currently, so that can be presented as part of the final budget when it comes forward. So there will potentially be a change to that impact, but what we're looking at is what those assumptions are around interest rates. So again, you're absolutely right, that work all needs to be done. It needs to be done as part of the wider budget process that we're currently part of the way through.
Because it's just because it's such a large figure that 9, nearly a million, and therefore so we're not going to expect to see anything more until, say, January in terms of what that figure might change to.
Thank you. Councillor Ekpignon and then Councillor Caston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So bearing in mind what the officers have just said, I'm a bit surprised that the long-term borrowing rate assumption is only at 2.5%. I mean, the Bank of England is basically indicating that interest rates will go up, the base rate will go up to 5% next year. So it does call into question both of these assumptions, I would say. I think, it may be, as the director is saying, a bit early in the cycle to give a more firm figure, but given that we're making assumptions, I have thought we ought to be erring on the side of caution in terms of interest rates. So I'd like some commentary back on that, please.
Yes, certainly, thank you. So that long-term borrowing assumption is for our current long-term borrowing, which has all been fixed. So the average rate on the long-term borrowing that we've currently got is 2.5%. So effectively this assumption is that we are not taking any further long-term borrowing. That is the rate for the long-term borrowing that we have, and anything else will stay as short-term borrowing.
Could I come back on that?
Please do.
So, thank you. That's a really good answer. I think really you ought to put that in the descriptive, because otherwise it's not really clear what that means.
Councillor Whitehead.
Yeah, I think in that column, if we put unchanged brackets, rate of 2.5%, that'd been clearer. Yeah, because it isn't. It's basically saying it would be unchanged because it's already fixed.
Yeah, but I still think that the answer that was given also should be included in the words next to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Field, you were waving. Have you got a question?
I thought Councillor Caston had one, was in front of me.
Oh, sorry, yes, you're quite right. Councillor Caston and then Councillor Field.
I was trying to save everyone the job by looking at the next Monday's audit paper. But the short-term borrowing, are we bringing that down with the income from the investments at the moment? Are we slowly paying that off? I'm sure it's in this paper, but I just can't quite find it.
Yes, I believe that is the case. That currently in the paper for audit next week, that is showing that has reduced certainly in the first half of the year. We do tend to see perhaps that increases towards the end of the year due to when we receive our money. So that will be ongoing review, but certainly any of the income that we're getting from SIFCO will be repaying that short-term borrowing.
Yeah, but where an investment fund is being used, because there's the smaller investments within the investment fund. Do we have a standard amount that we pay off of that? I assume that's what the short-term borrowing is. That's the investment accounts, the equity funds. that, or have I got that wrong?
Yes, the short-term borrowing isn't linked to our investments at all. So
Oh, isn't it? Oh,
no,
sorry.
so it's just the gap between what we need to borrow based on our capital programme and our expenditure compared to what we have in long-term borrowing. So that will fluctuate during the year based on cash flow, depending when we receive grants. And
Yeah,
what we're holding.
that's what confused me, because I didn't think we borrowed for that, but yeah, brilliant, thank you.
Can I ask a couple of questions? And they may be silly questions, but I'm told there's no silly question. Do we have to make the repayments on the long-term borrowing? Can we not make more repayments on the short-term borrowing so that we are still borrowing at 2.5% rather than 4.5%? And when do we see some benefit into this part of the budget from sales of houses at Newden Market and the range at Gateway 14?
Okay, so on the first part of the question, yes, certainly we do pay down the short-term borrowing first and foremost. A lot of that long-term borrowing is fixed, a maturity loan, so we repay it all at the end of the term, and we will hold it throughout. So
Thanks.
yes, it's the short-term borrowing that generally is repaid first.
And then in relation to the capital receipts that you're referring to, that really relates to the work that I mentioned earlier in response to Councillor Eburn's question. So we're currently looking at that capital programme, which includes capital receipts, so that we can look at what borrowing may be required moving forward, and also what repayment can be made as well. So that's work that's ongoing.
Because that could potentially, I guess, have a massive effect on this. Probably
Yes.
a greater effect than anything else we've talked about.
Yes, indeed. It could have a significant impact, particularly the Gateway 14 capital receipts. So yes, that's work that's currently ongoing now, because we know what a significant impact it could have on the council's finances.
Thank you. Any more questions or Councillor Field? Yes, sorry.
Yeah, I did have a brief one. I think you might just have got close to answering it then. The issue I always find a bit difficult. The short-term borrowing is just a lump, and it's clearly associated with Sifco. I think there's some short-term with Gateway 14 and something else. I was going to suggest our house building programme, but presumably that's in the HRA budget, not here. So just question, it would be convenient, I think, for councillors if we tried to separate that out into obviously big lumps, but a couple of big lumps rather than just one, so that one could get a grasp of how the range activities, for instance, at Gateway 14 might be impacting our need for short-term borrowing in that area. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think that's relevant observation, and certainly something we'll try to present better in the full budget moving forward.
So are there any more questions? We're happy to move on. Thank you.
Oops. So the final bit for the general fund is looking at the funding, so the central funding for council tax, business rates and government grants. For council tax, there has been an amendment to the figures from what was in the report, because we have worked through the tax base figures now in detail. So we are seeing a 3.28% growth on the tax base. And that's giving a £219,000 positive impact on the budget for 23-24. For Band D, for the increase to council tax, we're currently modelling a zero increase in the budget for 23-24. Obviously, that's a discussion point as we move through the process. As an example, a 2% increase would be 137,000. And a £5 increase would be 200,000. We've also got the potential impact of the LCTRS on here, so the potential to move to a 100% scheme from 95% scheme. It's currently under consultation. Just to note that although we've we have picked up the impact on this bit in the slides. We are expecting that in the medium term there will be efficiencies in delivery that will reduce that impact as going forward. For business rates, we don't know what the government are going to do at this point in time, but the general feeling with some of our advisors, Pixel, is that is likely to stay flat for 22-23, as it was in 22-23 for 23-24. So at this point, we are estimating that will be the same figure. Where we perhaps will see a little bit of a benefit is from the Suffolk-wide pool. So where all the growth will go, we're estimating a 2% growth at this point in time. In relation to central government grants, we're still expecting a review of funding at some point from central government, but we are not expecting that to happen this year. We are expecting the government announcement on the settlement, the draft settlement for 23-24 to come to us around the 21st of December. But at this point, we are assuming that it will be flat, so no change to the grants, the service grant, rural services delivery grant, or the lower tier services grant. The good news for Mid-Suffolk is that if the new homes bonus increases carries on the same scheme that it was in 22-23, there has been a decent amount of growth. So although it's a slight reduction on the budget for 22-23 of 399,000, we're still expecting to receive a decent amount from new homes bonus.
I've got a couple of people wanting to ask questions at this stage. Councillor Carter and then Councillor Eburn.
Thank you. Sorry, when it comes to me and acronyms, they never seem to stick in my head long. And when it comes into the LCTRS, which sounds nice if you try saying it together, it can't fathom what actually it stands for, what it impacts. And the other thing I had, with regards to the council tax and council tax increase, we recently have decided on for the universal credits I believe the council tax is not to be taken. So how's that being impacted where we're actually having the lower rates where we're no longer getting, which we need to do this, but how is it impacting our budget? Where is it written about here?
Okay, thank you. So the LCTRS is the Local Council Tax Reduction Scheme. So that does cross over with the point that you were making about universal credit. So absolutely right, there will be an impact on that. And that is the 154,000 that we're showing there. So the Local Council Tax Reduction Scheme incorporates the move potentially to 100% reduction, and also there's changes around universal credit and how those are calculated. So that's the 154,000 that is shown there.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
And Councillor Eburn, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just on the new homes bonus, so just to confirm, we're expecting about 1.3 million this financial year. And secondly, because obviously that's based on new homes bonus, is based on the growth over a certain amount that we're expected to do anyway. And you've said it's calculated using, an acronym. But just could you give the percentages, please, that's based on in terms of housing growth? Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, you're right. So we're expecting that to be about 1.3 million at this stage. The other acronym that's linked in there, the CTB1, is a council tax-based return that we do to central government. So the figures for the new homes bonus will come from that, and they will be the same figures that have fed into the tax-based growth up above. I don't have the exact figure that's fed into the new homes bonus, but I can find that and feed that back.
Thank you, Chair. I think that's useful to have that figure because it is a growth.
Absolutely.
It is an extra one, so thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Ekping.
Just to clarify, the 1.8 million of new homes bonus, that was the budget, right?
Yes, correct. That's the 22-23 budget.
And in your previous answer, do I take it that that's exactly the figure that we're going to hit in 22-23?
That's right. That budget was set after we'd had the settlement figures at the end of December.
Okay.
No further questions? So there's one more line. No, it's not on there. It's on our page. Yeah, so we can carry. I can't see the screen because I'm at such an angle. Right, thank you.
Okay, so that was the general fund position. We've now got a few slides on the HRA position. So for 22-23, we had a budget surplus of 95,000 in the HRA. We are seeing pressures currently mounting to around 500,000 from the pay award and also spend on subcontractors and increase in material and supply costs. Again, we are expecting those pressures to continue into 23-24. And for 22-23, we're currently showing a budget deficit of around 400,000. So in the report, we've set out some of the assumptions within the HRA. So the ones around pay and pensions are the same assumptions that we're building into the general fund budget. In addition, for the HRA, the main increases, are, as I said, are around premises costs, repairs and maintenance costs, contractors and supplies, services and equipment. So we are currently looking at around 10% increase on those for 22-23, and that's based on what we're currently experiencing in 22-23 plus a 10% increase for 23-24. Gas and electricity, we've got a higher increase there within the HRA that we're experiencing because of the difference in the contracts for those. So we're currently projecting a 100% inflationary increase on that. For water, it's based on the cost that we're experiencing in 2022-23 again, plus a 10% inflationary increase for 23-24.
Councillor Scarf, please.
Thank you, Chair. Well, obviously the position with the gas in this table for the HOA is significantly different to the position for the general fund. So the question would be, are we looking at reviewing our suppliers, because this is a huge increase here, whereas it's got very little effect on the general fund?
Thank you for the question. So I understand that we have some fixed price contracts for the HRA gas and electricity that are due to expire next year. So obviously we've probably benefited from those fixed price contracts recently, and that's why there's such a large increase in the cost. So it's that actually we've been protected from the rises recently, but obviously at the end of those contracts we'll need to renegotiate and enter into the best contracts we can at that point in time. So we based the assumption on the advice that we've had in terms of where that's likely to be. So it is a significant increase, but it's more a reflection on the fact that we've probably got better rates now because of the contracts we had in place originally.
Thank you.
Okay, so then
sorry, Councillor Field has put his hand up. Sorry.
Sorry to just continue that line of questioning for a moment, but gas and electricity, you're saying 100% increase, and I see from the other account that basically electricity was predicted to go up 100%, which is still less than one's paying personally, so that seems like a fairly low estimate. But gas was up in your previous figures, the quote per unit, whatever sort of unit that might be, was about a 3 or more times increase. So 100% here does seem to be currently quite a low guess. whether you're assuming that things will get less problematic as the year goes on. Looking at the current numbers, certainly the price of gas has come down, about halved in the last couple of months. So just a few more words about that. It does look as though it's something we could easily get very wrong, in the way Councillor Whitehead mentioned that forward guesses last year were dramatically out. This could be too.
And I think you're absolutely right. It's been a very volatile market, particularly over the last 12 months. We've based this estimate on advice. We'll continue to monitor as we progress closer to the budget being fixed. We are seeing some stabilisation and the hope for a bit more stabilisation later in the year. So a lot of it will come down to the actual date when the contract is due to expire. I haven't got that date right now, so I don't know how far into 23-24 the contract is due to expire and up for renewal. But I totally agree. It is a very difficult area to predict at this point in time.
Could I just ask one thing? Our contracts presumably are with companies that are big enough to withstand the loss that they must be making, because we all know Bulb went somewhat bankrupt, didn't it? And so did an awful lot of others. So we're with someone with deep pockets, are we?
I don't have the details of our contractors in this regard, but we do tend to work with suppliers who do have deeper pockets. Having said that, we have seen a lot of energy companies and suppliers who have struggled in recent times because of those price commitments that they made previously against the price of gas and electricity that they're actually having to buy. So we always try to do the sort of prudent and sensible thing, but in these kind of markets it can be quite difficult, even with those really reputable suppliers, to be honest.
No more questions? Do you want to move on, Rebecca?
Okay, so this is the final slide for the HRA. So this looks at the income that we're projecting for 23-24. For the rental income, we're currently got an assumption of 5% increase, which gives a 959,000 benefit. Just to point out that this is the assumption on our existing properties that we have already got within the HRA. At this point, we have not made an assessment of what the increase in properties might be for 23-24, or what that impact would be. So that will come further down the road and into the final budget. For garage rents, we're assuming no increase to garage rents based on the demand for those garages. It's felt that a price increase would reduce demand and potentially counterproductive, so there is no increase assumed there. For service charges, we've got 5% service charge, 8% for the heating and 11% for water, just to cover increase in costs. That would have a £14,000 positive impact on the 23-24 budget. I'll pause there.
Councillor Scarf.
Yeah, I'm interested on the garage rents figure, because for some time we've used this philosophy that if we increase the rents, we'll lose interest in the garages, and that would have a negative impact. But it could also have a positive impact, and it might actually provide us with sites where we could redevelop for housing. So I know it's very small potatoes in terms of the overall figures, but I think really we should look at whether we should actually be increasing garage rents at least by a small amount, because otherwise they are actually saving quite a lot of money over a short period of number of years by not having an increase. And I do question whether that's right, particularly because we always look at the tenants' rents in terms of the houses, who often actually are the renters of the garage, not always, and we generally increase the rent as well. So I question whether the philosophy behind that is actually right, because I know that we are seeing lack of interest in garage sites, but a lack of interest in garage sites could be seen as a benefit in terms of redevelopment and providing further social or affordable housing.
Thank you for that question. We are currently looking at garage sites across the district, both in terms of whether there are opportunities for redevelopment, as you mentioned, but also looking at how we can increase the use of those sites. So where we have got void properties, trying to re-let those. So that's a piece of work that has started quite recently in terms of how we can look to increase income from those assets, but also make sure they're being put to the best possible use. I think for the budget assumption purposes, I think because of the relatively low numbers that we're talking about, I think the assumption of a 0% increase is fair. But just so you know, behind the scenes, we are undertaking that piece of work. So we can look at that in a bit more detail.
Thank you. Councillor Eburn, have you got a question?
Thank you, Chair. Just on the rental income, and I think this is probably a question for Councillor Whitehead. The assumption is 5% in the budget, government's budget. Jeremy Hunt referred to 7%, and that's in fact quoted in discussed in all the press, you know, the FT and so forth. So has 7% been considered, or is that a decision? Is the decision 5%, or is that something that's still being considered, whether it might be 5 or 7 or something different? And secondly, really, what then, if it was to be a different assumption, because we're here talking about assumptions, what would 7% mean, or something lower than 5%? Thank you.
Thank you. In terms of this paper was put together before Jeremy Hunt did his last budget, and my understanding is that he indicated 7% was going to be the figure going forward, whereas I think before then, you know, that consultation talked about 3%, 5% or 7%. So we sort of took the prudent middle view. I mean, any percent increase will affect our tenants, but I think we should never lose sight that the HRA is in a very challenging position. And, you know, any increase in rent feeds through year after year after year. 1% we've got down there is the equivalent of £192,000. So another 2% on the 5% would give £384,000 a year to the HRA. Obviously that's money out of tenants' pockets or out of housing benefit. It's going to be a difficult decision, I think, at full council. You know, the original rules would have had CPI plus 1%, which I think was well over 11%, which does seem excessive. So it's really going to be a question of where we're going to pitch it. Say the 5% is a bit historical. I think if we'd been doing this after the budget rather than before the budget, we'd have put 7% in.
Thank you.
Councillor Caston.
Thank you. Previously on the HRA, when we've run a surplus, we've put the money into the Strategic Priorities Fund or something. What's that money doing now? Where is it? And how does that work when we take a surplus out of it?
Sorry, we put a surplus in at the end of the year. If we come in ahead of budget, then surplus goes into that reserve, which is basically it's a general reserve, even though it's got a fancy name, because it's basically the main reserve for the HRA. The budget deficits it will be taken out of there, and obviously it's a limited pot. I think at the moment we're sort of running, if it ran at the present rate, it'd run out in 10 years' time, whereas obviously the HRA is a long-term, 30-year beyond projection. So I think there are tremendous challenges within the HRA, and this budget is almost like a snapshot in time. The key thing will be we're working on the 30-year plan to HRA business plan to revise all those numbers and see where they come out.
So when you say 10 years, are you saying it's got about 70 million? Sorry, no, 7 million. Sorry, they've got my decimal points in the wrong place.
Somewhere between 6 and 7 million, and somewhere between 600 and 700,000 annual deficit is what I reckon to the 10-year. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Appingham.
Thank you, Chairman. Just coming back to Councillor Scar's question regarding garage rents, and I hear what the director said about the fact that this is a relatively small pot, and so zero increase seems fair. But on the other side of the coin, are there any costs associated with like maintaining these garages that would impact that we need to absorb as a council? And should we not be actually asking the people renting the garages to make up that increase?
So, as with every tenancy, the conditions for your occupancy are set by the terms of that tenancy. So if the tenancy says that we can recover costs of repairs, then we can and will recover costs of repairs. If the tenancy doesn't say that, we can't do it. So we can't change the rules once you've got a tenancy in place. There will be costs in terms of managing the garages. As with managing any property, there's always costs. We can only recover those costs if the tenancy documents allow you to do so.
Can I ask a question about the tenancy agreement? Does it require the garage to be used for a vehicle? Or, I mean, the reason I ask that is that a garage could be seen as quite cheap storage, and you could sort of lend it out to a mate who's running a business, and that would be a cheap way of doing it. So I wonder if, as Councillor Scarr said, if we did put up the garage rents, we might flush out the people who no longer see it as cheap storage.
I can't respond in terms of the garage tenancies. I don't know the tenancy details for our garage estate well enough to be able to confirm that, but certainly we can look at that outside of this meeting, and it's interesting to understand the level of interest in relation to these properties from councillors.
And if garage blocks of say 10 garages, there's only 3 of them that are rented out, we do seem to be putting a lot of money into maintaining 7 that aren't being used. So I think there is a piece of work there that does need to be looked at. But I guess, would tenants feel it's wrong that they have to move to a different garage?
So I think we're probably straying from the terms of the report. More than happy to have a conversation outside of this meeting around garages and how we're looking at them. They are quite complex. In reality, they normally involve a number of different tenancies, and quite a bit of work needs to be done in order to change the status quo. But more than happy to have that conversation outside of this meeting.
There does seem to be a number of reasons why it would be a good idea to increase garage rent, so if you would look at that, that would be good. Have we got any further questions? Councillor Field.
Thank you. Just one. I can't resist saying, presumably evidence from yesterday's, or was it the day before's incident in Sudbury will point some way on garages. I think 19 got somewhat knocked over. The question is on premises costs and repairs and maintenance. I missed the thought that it talks about CPI plus 10% and Q2 forecasts. And the budget's 2 million, and there's a 1 million extra hit for next year, which is somewhat more than 10%. Is there something hidden somewhere that we're increasing the amount of maintenance we're doing? I certainly know of sort of sheltered accommodation where maintenance is not getting done for 1 to 2 years, so that might be sensible, but it'd be interesting to know what the basis for this estimate is.
Yep, certainly. So the comparison there is between the 22-23 budget and the 23-24 budget, as well as the 10% inflationary increase. The movement also includes the pressure that we're seeing during 22-23. So there's already a difference between our forecast for 22-23 compared to the budget for that. So that will be part of that 1 million increase. And then as well as the 10%. So that 1 million is a combination of inflation we are already seeing in 22-23 and an additional 10% forecast for 23-24.
Councillor Castor.
Just going back to that 7 million in the strategic priorities fund. Are we paying interest on that 7 million into the HRA account for that money?
Yes, there is a calculation that compensates the HRA for that interest.
Yeah, you don't know what percentage?
That is based on the average interest that the council is getting on all of its investments. So
yeah.
I don't know the exact figures.
Yeah, no, but that's what it'll be. You're just pooling all the interest and getting an average interest figure.
Get the average rate, and then based on what the HRA has in its balances.
And that gets paid into the HRA. That's an income for the HRA. That interest. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Scarf, then Councillor Ekpeel.
Thank you, Chair. Well, it's off the slide, but it's in the paperwork. Will you allow me to ask a question?
Well, so,
it's not on the slide specifically, but it's on the narrative.
I was going to ask, do we need to see the slides anymore? Shall we have the lights on? If there's no more questions, or if we need to, we'll come back to them. Sorry, carry on, Councillor.
Okay. Well, on page 12, 5.7 sort of identifies the work to continuing to identify savings, efficiency and income generation opportunities and reduce the impact of the increasing costs within the HRA. Now, I know that the HRA is ring-fenced, but my question would be, is it possible for items like materials required by housing repairs to be bought by the general fund and recharged to the HRA at a lower cost? Is that legal?
No, I don't believe that is. That would be subsidising the HRA, which we're not able to do.
Okay, so is there any other avenue, because I know this is a frequently asked question, is there any other avenue where the general fund could support some of the elements of the housing revenue account costs? I know the Chair mentioned one in the pre-briefing, because I think if there is anything that we could exploit and any creative way of doing that, I want to make sure that obviously we're maximising the opportunity, because the HRA being in deficit and the general fund being in significant surplus is always an area which causes councillors some dismay, because we see the position on the HRA and we don't really, having just adopted the new HRA business plan, want to backtrack on the retrofitting and all of the programmes that we've got because we're actually running a deficit.
Yes, we are very restricted on what we can do, and we can't do anything to subsidise the HRA. What we are doing is doing a review of the recharges between the general fund and the HRA to make sure that they are fair and representative of the actual cost to the HRA. Similarly, with interest costs, there is some work to make sure that they also are fair, and we will keep reviewing that, but we're not able to sway that unfairly. It's got to be audited, it's got to be transparent, and it's got to represent the actual cost.
Can I just make a point before we come on to you, Councillor Whitehead? I guess you were going to answer that. Yours is a response. The Councillor Scarf referred to something that I'd mentioned, and I'd mentioned it last year as well, and that is that the grassed areas, the planted areas around council houses, and in particular around sheltered housing, are seen by all residents in villages as public open space. And yet it appears to me that the HRA account has to pay for the cutting of the grass and grounds maintenance. Is that an area that could be looked at to see whether, I mean, the HRA are paying for a benefit to all residents. Is there a way of offsetting that cost? I'm not expecting an answer now, but could that be looked at over the next few weeks? I think that was the reference you were making, Councillor Scarl. Councillor Whitehead, and then I'm coming on to Councillor Ekpinghaul.
Sorry, yeah, the point I was going to make is that we will certainly be as creative as we possibly can with this, but we are pretty much limited by law, but within the scope of the law we'll try and be as creative as possible. I'd certainly make the point to the committee that Councillor Haddingham, as the Cabinet Member for Housing, is always all over this and very protective of her baby, and is trying to maximise as much as she can, getting funding from the general fund where possible to the HRA.
Right, thank you. Councillor Ekpinghaul.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also have a question related to 5.7 on page 12. But before I get to that, I'm a bit curious. I mean, obviously there is some law that says we have to segregate HRA from our general fund, but effectively it seems like an artificial division because it's all the same pot of activity, so Mid-Suffolk District Council. So why are we, on the one hand, generating surpluses, and then on the other hand, creating deficits that are costing us money, and not being able to do some sort of offsetting? I mean, it just seems crazy to me. You wouldn't run a business like that. I mean, this is just not sensible. And I think, if it is enshrined in law, I think we should be lobbying government to change it. It's a nonsense, really, in the overall scheme of things. So with that little rant, on to my question, is that we talk about some activities that could potentially benefit the HRA in the transformational work and so on, which have yet to be built into the budget as it stands. But is there an expectation that some of this work will have a beneficial impact on the figures for 23, 24 and beyond?
I think, to be honest, there's quite a lot of stones to turn over, and I think it's more likely, if anything, that may be disadvantageous rather than advantageous, the things we find. That's my gut reaction, anyway.
So we're going to increase the deficit, basically. Is that what you're saying?
I think there's more scope for the deficit to increase than decrease, but then, of course, that will then become a timing issue as to when the work's done. If that's not too slippery an answer.
Well, actually, it is a slippery answer, I have to say, using your words. But it goes to my general point. You're creating huge deficits in one hand, and then the other hand can't help it. I mean, it just seems a bit, I don't know, can't think of the word for it just now, but it seems to me completely at odds with trying to run an efficient business.
I think the reality is we are running two quite discrete businesses. We're running a general fund council business, and we're running a HRA business, which is purely and utterly focused on our council housing stock. And the law says quite clearly that you can't cross-subsidise the two. So we're doing the best we can within the scope of the statute and the limitations put on us.
Councillor Caston.
I was just thinking more about that interest on the money in that account. Would it be possible to have a new deal for the interest in there, so that a new deal is negotiated between the HRA and the council for the interest paid on there? Because it's at 3%, the baseline, that's 210,000 roughly. At the 4.5 that we're borrowing short term with, that's 315,000, and that slows down a bit the decline of that HRA account. Firstly, is that possible, or And the second thing is, what is wrong with the HRA account? How do we've got 10 years, probably less, to save it from having no money and being in deficit. Do we have to cannibalise it, i.e. sell assets off it to keep it afloat? Or is there some way of dealing with that to make it more efficient, to rescue it, in your opinion?
So I think firstly we probably do just need to bring the meeting back to the purpose. So we're here to look at the assumptions within the budget so that we can develop that budget further over the next few months. And I think we need to be careful not to stray into trying to fix the problems that we're identifying in these assumptions in this meeting. There is work that is ongoing currently, and particularly with our new housing director who joined us last week, reviewing the HRA business plan that was set in the summer in the context of the economic changes that we've seen over the last few months particularly. So we will be looking at this in quite some detail over the next few months because we do need to make sure that we do what we can to put the HRA back onto a kind of even keel so that we're in a more positive position. We welcome any ideas that you may have, and we can pass those back to both finance colleagues and the housing director to look at those in further detail. But I think for the purpose of today, we probably do need to focus on the assumptions that have been set out in this paper.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. So the question would be, why don't we include the interest that's coming from that in these assumptions?
Sorry, I've lost a page there.
We can look to do that.
Yeah. Sorry, we'll look to do that outside of the meeting.
Okay, all right.
Thank you. Councillor Field and then Councillor Scarf.
I was just going to point out one of the issues, obviously, is we don't recognise the social or economic value of providing low-cost housing. And there's obviously a value to us and to companies. You can employ people at lower salaries if they got really cheap houses, and that's not recognised anywhere. But the serious comments for today really are, it'd be my view that there are several elements of this budget which need a very close examination, and you're saying we have new directors on board to do that. Certainly, while something like gas and electricity is probably truly beyond our control, although we can make assumptions about which direction of travel that's accommodating. But there's things like supplies, equipment, tools, where the increment is like 30%, and the premises repairs and maintenance costs, well, I just pointed out the increment is like 50%. So there are a number of things that really need a careful examination, and it would be wrong to make sort of sweeping statements here about whether they're right or wrong, but they do need, they are a considerable concern. I was also going to point out there are things like, some of the challenges is this account, things like retrofitting houses with improved insulation and windows and whatsoever there may be, and there are clearly government grants available in that area, and government grants you can never guarantee you're going to get them, but clearly we need to look at that very thoroughly and make sure that councillors understand just how hard we're trying to get government money to sponsor improvements to our housing stock, which will have environmental impact as well as just impact on these residents. So I think there are a number of elements here that I'm not in any way saying are being done incompetently, but do look as though there are some large increases, and we do need to make sure we've got the right management effort on those increases to ensure that they are no more than is strictly necessary. and that maybe in some of these cases where the cost of tools or something has jumped up, that you may need to delay purchase for a year or two until they go back to sensible levels. So there are a number of things that are difficult to follow in a meeting like this, but do need careful examination in my view. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, are we ready to move on to debate? We've had quite a lot of questioning. And thank you very much for the presentations and for the way that you've answered questions. We have challenged quite a lot, and I'm grateful for what you've done in answering. So, do you want to debate? Do you want to start thinking about recommendations? There are one or two areas here which we might point out as areas to challenge. What we have done in the past is merely to say, please take everything we've said into account, but perhaps this year there are things that we want to pinpoint for further work. Councillor Muller.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I would certainly sort of challenge the 0% increase in garage rents, and I think that's been discussed quite openly here today, and I think that needs to perhaps be reconsidered in this Chair in particular.
Councillor Epping, and then Councillor Scarf.
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered whether you're sort of asking us to have specific recommendations with respect to the different assumptions, or whether actually in the round we might say, okay, given the comments that we've made during the questioning and the responses that we've had, that the officers take those on board in terms of our concerns regarding those, a certain number of these assumptions that we're not happy with.
What we've done in the past, as I said, is just to say take everything into account. But I think on this occasion, because we have spent quite a bit of time on one or two specific, or more than one or two, but some specific elements, whether we want to say take account of the question, what was heard in the questioning and the challenges and the debate, but in particular, we would suggest looking further at for instance, a vacancy management factor of 5%. That's one thing that I think has been highlighted. Look again at the possibility of raising garage rents, and there may be other things that you feel should be on the list. I'm not looking for a list of every single sort of element, but there may be one or two that we particularly feel should be looked again at. Councillor Scarf.
Yeah, Chair, I mean, coming back to the housing revenue account and the difficulties in terms of funding that, I think it would be difficult to make radical changes to the assumptions that are in our papers in terms of how close we are to the budget. But I think one of the things that we would like to see, it's mentioned that we've got a new Director of Housing, for example, and a new pair of eyes brings a new outlook on things. I think there is some work there that we would like to see done to see whether there is any way that creative ways of thinking could improve the current position of the housing revenue account. Now, it might not be able to do that in terms of this year's budget, but I think in terms of a marker for future years, I think that is something that members right across the council have some concern with, and that we make the most use of whatever flexibility we have to support the housing revenue account in whatever way that is possible. I think that's quite a big piece of work potentially, but one I think we should ask Cabinet to perhaps take a look at in the longer term. If there's something possible to improve the figures for this year's budget, then all well and good, but if not, as a longer term piece of work.
It's easy to say, but difficult to put into written word, other than to say, see if you can fiddle the books without fiddling the books. But look at, well, I don't know. How do we write it down? And look at ways of reducing the.
Perhaps as simple as something like looking at the opportunities, the flexibility that the housing revenue account ways of working, perhaps something like that. I think we know I think we all know what we want to say, but it is difficult to put it into words. maximising the flexibility for the housing revenue account. Perhaps something like that.
It does seem to me, actually, that and it's obviously not for this, but the long-term objective ought to be that the housing revenue account washes its face, really.
Yeah.
I think, from my point of view, if I'm going to go along with Councillor Whitehead's idea of it being two businesses, then I'd hate to be in charge of a loss-making business of this size, and I would want him to come back to me and tell me how he's going to get rid of it and make it, at least a break-even business. No.
Anyone else? Councillor Caston.
I did talk about it. I think the money in the strategic priorities fund should become an income for the RHA instead of being accrued within the account, and be brought the profit, the interest, to become an income within that account. If that makes sense. It seems at the moment the interest from the money in the I keep having to remember the from the account where so we got 7 million from previous surpluses. In that account, it seems like the interest from that stays in that account, but I think that that should be turned into income within the HRA. That yearly produced interest should go in as an income. But I've said that, and I think that's been taken into consideration. I don't know whether it needs to be a recommendation, but it does deal with a little bit of the deficiencies in the fund. But I'm quite happy to have just said that in the meeting, and the portfolio holders heard it, and the directors have heard it.
Councillor Peel.
I have a question for the director, actually. The work that we're doing in mid-Suffolk growth, is that outside of the HRA or within the HRA, and to what extent would that help the HRA if it were?
It's outside of the HRA, it's a general fund function. The only exception is where the HRA is benefiting from the end product. So, for example, with the properties that we've developed at Needham Market at the HQ site, we have 10 properties that will be owned by the HRA, so they'll then benefit from the income return on those properties. But the other activities are a general fund function.
Councillor Carter.
Yes, I'm afraid my contributions to today have been rather hectic, and I'm in the headspace right now. We are in a meeting regards assumptions that were wrong previously, which we know at the moment the assumptions we're still working on. So we know that these ones are wrong, but we're going to, for this purpose of meeting, we're going to go forward assumptions which are known unknowns and unknown knowns that we don't know yet. So paperwork which basically we're waiting for the other shoe to drop. We're still pushing through for this one. In my mind at the moment, we had a meeting yesterday where we had it's ringing on my ears, the talk from the Citizens Advice Bureau about the concerns that they have. We are looking at changes to universal credits, which are supposed to make it for a 3-month turnaround. But when we last did universal credit changes, we were looking at 18 months where the clients were going without payment. We have people who are who are doing 3 jobs but aren't eligible for housing benefits because of the income bracket. So we are, and we are in a recession. This is going to get worse. How secure is this? Should the other shoe drop, and it's going to get worse and hit the people harder? How secure are we if people aren't able to pay for the rents? How much are we going to be looking at chasing for repayments and having more find more costs that way? Are we going to be seeing, okay, yes, we're going to make a loss next year, but we're going to have to deal with it later? Are we thinking of people may be out without benefits for up to 18 months? We may have to swoop in to actually cover the cost like we did last time, and are we going to be having the inflation that way? Are we thinking of that in this budget? I don't see it reflected there. And also we've got employment where we say there must be a secure employer, yet when we're looking at what bracket are we employing? Because if it's what age group, where we're looking at some for grandparents are having to leave work to look after children, which is the same reason why we have a loss in volunteers. Is this going to be affecting us as a business? Who are we employing? How secure is it? We don't know whether or not they're going to be able to afford to be able to work for us, if they're going to be in their brackets to it. So this budget is how secure it looks great in paper, but how genuinely secure is it when next year we have no idea how the other share is going to drop? And what's the point looking at it if we don't know yet?
Councillor Carter, we're looking at comments to be made in the recommendation, and I mean, by all means, we could express our concern about the unknown. Express concern about the unknown, but I think everybody knows that there's an unknown. So I'm not sure that it's worth putting into a recommendation to cabinet, to officers or the portfolio holder. I've got Councillor Ekping and then Councillor Casson. Councillor Field, did you want to make a comment at some point? But not now. I'll come to you in a bit. Well, let's see if it comes up in debate, and if it's a burning issue that you feel we need to take into account, then I'll come to you. Councillor Ekping.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think if I was going to make a recommendation, it would be that I think with regards to the pay award and effectively anything that's really got a huge influence in terms of staff costs, we ought to be looking at something that's in line with the anticipated inflation rate for next year, which is in the order of 6%, because I think that would be the more prudent step to take, rather than assuming we'll do better than that. That, I guess, would be one of my recommendations in terms of how we look at these assumptions going forward.
Councillor Caston.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we've got a couple of recommendations there. I'm quite happy for what's been said in this meeting to be taken on board, and to maybe leave it at that, because this is a really difficult thing to do. And thank you so much for everything you've done in this meeting. It's been a lot more intense than maybe I thought it was going to be, but it's budget, and budget always seems to be like that. And thank you very much for everything you've done, particularly Rebecca, who I think had to just been brilliant with answers and just had to sort of defend quite a lot in there. But it's a difficult piece of work to do, because you're working with things that you just don't know. And if you say one thing, the councillors will question you on the other. It's what we're here to do. We're here to just try and pull things to pieces the best we can. And but thank you very much. But yeah, I didn't know if you wanted a proposal.
Well, I was going to read out the notes that I've got here at some point.
Yeah.
Councillor Field, have you got something to say that might make a difference to this?
I'd hope so. My thought just is that there is considerable concern about the HRA budget. Councillor Whitehead pointed that out, that one recognises the administration will be working on that, but the committee should recognise there is a problem and that it would advise that various elements of that, for instance, premises and repairs cost, contractors' costs, supplies, tools and maintenance, need a very careful examination and detailed justification of them before we push ahead with this budget. It's a vital account, it provides an important function, and we need to be absolutely sure that it's being managed as well as it possibly can be, bearing in mind there have been a lot of staff changes. So that's not a recommendation, that's just comments. I think you need to recognise, you need to recommend that it's looked at very carefully and that the results are made visible to the committee. So that would be my view. There are some costs, and there is always a suspicion that we're suffering big costs because we're trying to expand our housing stock, and that's like investing for future business. It shouldn't be carried by the current business. And we have tenants who are not the most wealthy people in the world, who are at risk of carrying considerable costs that they shouldn't be carrying. So we must make sure the two elements of it, it's growth, or in fact three elements, it's growth, it's move to be climate change compatible, whatever we call it, and its existing running costs should be clearly seen, clearly analysed, and we should have a view that we know what's going on, because clearly the administration member here, the portfolio holder, was concerned about the overspend in this area, so it needs examining carefully. Sorry, that's a very long way of saying a simple thing. There you go.
Thank you, Councillor Field. Councillor Akpion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start by, endorsing Councillor Caston's comments regarding the effort that the officers and the portfolio holder have put into the process so far, and to thank them for the clarification of the various points that have been raised during the course of the meeting. That said, I am uncomfortable with the way in which we present budgets in this council. It seems to me that we spend a lot of time comparing a new budget with an old budget, and I frankly don't see much value in that. If you set a budget, and I've been doing this all my professional life, you set a budget, then you see how you perform against that budget. And I note that currently the Cabinet are not going to get the outturn for Q2 until next month, which is almost a full quarter after the quarter has ended. Well, that never happened in any business I've ever been involved in. You usually get that information within 4 or 6 weeks of the quarter end. So, in a sense, I feel that we're being asked to look at a new plan without much information as to how we performed against the last plan. And I do think that we need to address this issue, because if I'm someone looking in at this meeting on YouTube, I'd be going, what are they doing? What has actually happened? They have a budget for 22-23. How did that work out? And what's the forecast for the end of the year? And then how does that inform the new budget? It seems to me that this committee is being asked, and indeed Council has been asked in the past, to make such commentary without that information being readily available. I don't think that's quite right. And I think if I had one particular request, is that that whole process needs a review.
Yeah, I understand that, and I think that really is a matter for audit, isn't it? Rather than for here. So, do we want a recommendation that they look at more timely presentation of quarterly?
Well, I think there are two things, Mr. Chairman. One is getting the actual quarterly information in a more timely fashion. And the other one is really actually also being able to look at what's actually happened versus what we said would happen, and what our, if you like, the rest of the year outcome is looking like, and therefore how that informs the new budget.
Right, the things I've got written down here are that we welcome this earlier opportunity to consider the draft budget assumptions and thank officers for their presentation and clarification. We request Cabinet and officers to take account of comments made during the meeting. We ask them to look again at opportunities to reduce recharges from HRA to General Fund. Look again at the vacancy management factor of 5%. Consider further opportunities to increase, consider further the opportunities to increase garage rents. To suggest a more prudent assumption in respect of the pay award for 23-24 could be 6%. We recognise that the HRA budget is finely balanced and recommend that costs, I stop there, that costs of the various elements are looked at very carefully. Something like that?
Mr. Chairman, could you just read out the first one again? Sorry, I didn't catch it.
The first one.
The first item you read out.
We welcome this earlier opportunity to consider the draft budget assumptions and thank officers for their presentation and clarification.
Was there something before you said you requested the comments made in this meeting are taken?
That was what, yeah, that was what I said.
That was the first
yeah.
item. Sorry, yeah, apologies.
That's okay. It's what we can say about, we recognise that the HRA budget is finely balanced, and as Councillor Field pointed out, we recommend that the assumptions made against, in particular, I think it was costs of repair, maintenance, supplies and equipment. I mean, it's the repairs and maintenance, because that's where the bulk of the money is. The assumptions made against the costs of repair and maintenance be looked at more carefully. More carefully, in more detail, rather than more carefully. And then the final one was to try to put into the written word what Councillor Ekpiyong said about we would ask for more timely quarterly information on the General Fund and HRA income and expenditure, but that is something which I think probably, does audit look at these quarterly reports from General Fund and HRA? So they just go to Cabinet. So we just ask that Cabinet are provided with.
Well, the thing is that if it's provided to Cabinet in a timely fashion, then when we come to have this kind of meeting, that information is also available to the committee. It's also part of the budget process of understanding how we're performing against the current year's budget and how that then influences the budget we're setting for the next financial year.
So what I've written down now is more timely quarterly information on the general fund and HRA income and expenditure, and for this to be used to develop the general fund and HRA budgets and made available to this committee. Shall I read them all again? I would rather, I know there's one or two heads being shaken, but I would rather read them all again, and then having read them all, if you're happy with them, we'll then vote, and then you can trust the officers and I to put them into some sort of sensible order. If you're happy with that, we'll go ahead on that basis. So, we welcome this earlier opportunity to consider the draft budget assumptions and thank officers for their presentation and clarification. We request that Cabinet and officers take account of the comments made during the meeting. We ask that they look at opportunities to reduce recharges from HRA to General Fund, to look further at the vacancy management factor of 5%, to consider further the opportunities to increase garage rents. We suggest a more prudent assumption in respect of the pay award 23-24 could be 6%. We recognise that the HRA budget is finely balanced and recommend that the cost assumptions in respect of repairs and maintenance be looked at in more detail. And we ask for more timely quarterly information on General Fund and HRA income and expenditure to be provided, and this information to be used to develop the budgets and made available to this committee. Does that all? Can I ask the officers if is that okay if we write that all out? We'll spend a little while before we depart. So, on the basis of what I've read out, can we go to? Do we want to go to an electronic vote? Okay.
We need a proposal.
So yes. So you, yeah, we do need. We've got a proposer here, Councillor Ekpiyong and Councillor Caston seconded. Thank you. Right, so.
Thank you, Chair. Members, that vote is now in progress. Chair, do you want me to take your vote verbally?
I think I'm there now, at last.
Thank you, Chair. So that is 6 votes for, so that is unanimous.
Thank you very much. And yeah, that concludes the business of the meeting, and the time is 11:50. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you, officers. Thank you, Councillor Whitehead. Thank you very much. The next meeting will be on the 19th of December.